Hello everybody. Welcome. It's a little chilly here, so you might hear a little bit of mic noise from my mic being inside my hoodie. Out for a walk in the evening in a neighborhood I grew up in. It's very, it's a very disorienting experience in the sense of I'm very used to my common haunts, and as many of you know, I live in San Francisco. And ordinarily, I spend a good portion of my day in living places within the city. And that's very important for me, because the highly structured places of the city, well, I find them disturbing. In many senses. Of course, most of us who have lived in cities, we also find the structured predictability and sequencing of cities familiar. One might say it's an addictive kind of deprivation, right? We're walking on the pavement. We still have to be careful, but much less careful than if we're walking on wild land or places where there aren't already trails. If there's not already trails, we have to be actively sensitive. Meaning, we become intimate with the transformations beneath our feet as we travel. And the signals around us, all of which transform from dead mechanical object signals like cars and streetlights and smartphones to living signals. The direction the breeze is coming from. The music of the animals, presuming there are some we can hear. And if we're very sensitive to the land, then an array of effectively magical things occurs. Magical for most of us who've never experienced them, and yet probably those who are familiar with them would also agree there's something extraordinary and non-ordinary in the living world. Now, even in cities, in most of the places, the living world hasn't been entirely evicted, but that seems to be the basic idea, right? Control things. Make them predictable. Reduce novelty so that we can carry out the relatively superficial transactions that our lives in cities are built around and require to be maintained. I've known the place I'm walking in a peculiar phase of my life many decades ago. And I've been inside most of the houses, many of the houses anyway, that I'm walking past, and knew people who lived there and had adventures here. And so one of the things that's happening for me is, and there's a lot of different things happening for me, or as me, I'm flooded with memory, recollections of previous times and situations, events, relationships, misadventures, adventures, pain, love, confusion, wonder, hope. And so, before I began, I was thinking briefly about what is, and I think must be, one of the most central meta-topics we can become curious about, and that is memory. Ordinarily, we think of memory in a pretty simple way. We think of it as a collection of recordings, or at least that's the analogy we might use. These are traces left over in our, we think, consciousness of previous time and our relations within it. That's our standard sort of surface level thought about memory. But usually that's what's meant when we use this word. In different contexts, the word takes on different meanings and connotations. We have this idea that when someone we love dies, we will engage in memorial activities and behaviors. And many of us, make commitments to keep them alive in our lives and heart, our spirit. When I said memory is a meta-topic, what I meant is there's a particular cognitive move that I call it an attack on the supercontainer. And what that is a situation where someone attempts to say, rather distinctly and blatantly, what everything is. Right? Now, honestly, it would be a lot more interesting if we knew, for example, what everything was, quote, for, unquote, or what everything is doing, unquote. Like, what's the fundamental purpose of everything? What's the purpose that all things share? All processes, all things, all moments, all situations. And these are dangerous ideas because the supercontainer should remain, I think, in an intelligent mind, the supercontainer should have a generous portion of mystery and the unknown associated with it. And by a generous portion, I mean like 80+%. In ordinary circumstances, our faculties are very narrow, and so too our intelligence, curiosity, thoughtfulness, insight, awareness, right? In ordinary circumstances, moment to moment, as one's driving down the street or walking, unless one is engaged in deep thoughts or, active curiosity, we tend to just continue with the habits that we're familiar with. And we also have habits that we tend to preserve when thinking about things, and we're mostly unaware of them. But if we could drop them for a moment and be free of the sequencing of our history and thought line, a vast and beautiful, perhaps even an ecstatic mystery would immediately emerge in our awareness. And we would realize, I am this mystery. This mystery is my mind. Though our verbal realizations would be nearly useless when compared with the actual experience of liberation from our thoughts, ideas, identifications, and so on. An attack on the supercontainer resembles something like when some extremely crude headline says, your brain is a computer, or the universe is a hologram, or something like this. And almost always the is of identity, right, is employed, meaning we're going to say one thing is really just, and that just word is important, some other thing that we're familiar with, and often, strangely, truly in a kind of terrifying way, this other thing is some technology humans have developed. Now, whatever might be going on, that's impossible. It's formally impossible that your mind is just a computer, the universe is just a hologram, and even if the universe was a hologram, what's it a hologram of, and why, and who made it, and so on and so forth. Now, it can't be a hologram for simple reasons, but all of these arguments avoid where I want to go. And I've made them many times before, though I often repeat myself as I get older. But what if memory is most of what's going on? If we were going to compare the universe to something, especially the universe of our incarnate experience, and we look very carefully, we may find, to our surprise, that the idea that everything is memory is both non-technological, fascinating, and relatively easily demonstrated. Time-space is the memory of the development of this universe. Worlds are the memory of their formation in time-space, and stars and such. Organisms are memory lineages. Our minds, particularly our conscious minds and our linguistic minds, are the preserved memory traces of hundreds of thousands of generations of living human beings, and their relationships with the world, living places, plants and animals, insects, ideas. So if I was going to make a clumsy attack on the supercontainer, which generally I prefer not to do, but if someone sort of, nudged me and really wanted me to have a go at it, I might consider saying that everything is memory. And fundamentally, this is one perhaps superficial interpretation of the meaning of karma. Karma is memory in the context of a being's many existences. And we usually think of this as though a separate being is having many existences. But that's an unnecessary derivation. Clearly, none of us are entirely distinct. We are not merely connected, we are coexisting, right? We only exist together. Even though, you can go home and sit in your room by yourself, quote unquote, and do something, unless you're doing something that's just creative, and even if you are writing a story or a song, you're interacting with memory, and you're structuring memory. And all kinds of memorial assets come into play. Therefore, we're not really alone. Though we may feel loneliness and things like that, and those feelings may be natural to us. It's not that they're just a superficial expression of something that's confused, although many deep spiritual traditions might posit this. So my point is that there's no such thing really as a separate self, except that we think that way. And so that separate self exists in our thoughts. I'm reminded that some time ago I had a dream in which I was looking in a mirror in the dream, and I had a different face. And I was quite confused, and I wasn't sure I really liked this face, and I thought I maybe preferred my old one, and things like this, or at least this is what I remember thinking about my dream, or in my dream, presuming that in a dream I was thinking at all. I remember, anyway, having these feelings or concerns. The ideas of distinction and separateness that arise in our common thinking and perhaps influence how we live our lives, these ideas are they're a particular kind or species of fiction. A very compelling fiction in certain ways, but nonetheless a relatively superficial one. Under the right circumstances, if we were relieved of our representational overlays and their trenchant influence on how we think and also our feelings, we would likely have an experience of a kind of grand celebration of profound ecstatic communion among all beings in all of time. And even the idea of a separate self, when examined carefully, even if it's examined in the light of some tradition, such as the Vedas or Zen Buddhism, this idea, it doesn't hold much water, not for very long. It dissolves pretty quickly, so that we could imagine that the self, quote unquote, that travels through many incarnations or existences is actually a constellation of self-like processes, some of which are preserved, some of which make new friends, some of which fall away, but something very complex, like a web of elements in 5 or more dimensions, including time. The dimension that we often ignore in English and science is the most profuse dimension of all. It's the dimension of relationship. And of course, science has to use particular tools to evict relationship so that it can study very specific, formalizable aspects of situations and transformations and such. Much in the way the cities evict nature, or otherwise encage it. So with this view, one can see that the idea of karma, one can hold it in their mind without the cognitive drag produced by the illusion that karma is something that happens to a separate, distinct self, and that memory is something that belongs to a separate, distinct self. When really what we have is more like a neighborhood, or like a living place. Myriads of elements and beings, past, present, and future, in a vast web of relations and transformation and mutuality and conflict and all of these things, yeah? So not really a separate self. Or rather, something much more fascinating than the idea of a separate self, and something infinitely more plausible. Because the separate self is really not possible. You didn't acquire language from yourself. You didn't acquire your habits of thinking or behavior from yourself. You learned them by observing and emulating other human beings and living places, living creatures, relationships. But you can see how compelling the attack on the supercontainer that is expressed as everything is memory is. Now that doesn't tell us what memory itself is. It just finds in our lexicon an element that has some likeness and perhaps explanatory power, though the second's less interesting, about the nature of what's going on. It's all memory. Everything is formed of ancient origins and relationships and transformations and conservations and it's the opposite of a conservation. Things discarded, parts that fell away or were lost, elements that dissolved or disappeared. Now, of course, do they ever actually disappear? Well, that's a matter of locality, right? Depends on where you are in time and relation, whether things disappear or not. Since we presume that we cannot, in our separate selves, travel back in time to re-experience or newly experience something remembered or someone remembered, we become sort of confused and we think, oh, I only exist right here now. And there are many spiritual traditions that would like us to adopt that perspective for useful purposes. Something very profound about existing right here now and just being right where you are right now, in full presence. Of course, it can never be explicitly complete, but mostly present where you are with what you're with right in this moment. And allowing that to transform freely as it does without a lot of resistance or much resistance. Though, of course, we take care not to suffer injuries and not to suffer. But most of our suffering, not all of it, is in our minds. Yeah, it's in how we think, and it's also in the forms of awareness that we preserve and reenact and embellish and so on. It's a peculiar feeling to walk in this old neighborhood where I was a teenager for a time and a child for a time, and see these old houses and how the trees have grown. There's something kind of comforting about the fact that it still exists, because I think it had come to seem to me almost like an alternate universe, right? And I do think that I think we're also confused about the idea that our life is a single thing, though, there's a sense in which that's true. The human I was born as is still a going concern. For the moment, my body is still doing the body things, my mind, all these things. But really what I am is a concretion of memorial relationships and investments and such that the universe has made, and the sun has made, and the world is made, the moon is made, my parents made, all the beings that I directly encounter make, billions of beings that I indirectly encounter make, and some of those billions of beings make me up. Right? I don't directly encounter my own cells, and yet we must imagine that the hyperstructure of the cells that are my body are the ones that are speaking right now. Huh? So you are hearing the voice of my cells. Even if it is, how to put this, a representational voice, right? Like a layer of the possibility of what my cells might communicate. If they could freely communicate with humans, the species that is both alien to them and they comprise it. One of the ways to think about organisms is as hyperstructures endowed over millennia of development and relation by cells, by single-celled organisms. Almost as if single-celled organisms engineered the macro forms of life that we take as being the obvious and most important in awareness things. Well, that would be a really peculiar idea. We don't experience the transformations of the registers within computers. We relate with the computer through the screen, primarily. But inside the computer are trillions of components transforming moment to moment to produce the illusion that appears on the screen in a way that resembles, perhaps, I would say, I would certainly put the dream in precedence, resembles a vision or a dream. And this began first with radio and then with... Because the amazing thing about radio was that we had to imagine the pictures, right? When there were, before TV, when stories were told on the radio, basically you had kind of two forms of content. One was news, which really should be called something other than that. And the other was stories or dramas or comedies or such. So in the beginning, our technologies brought our imaginations to life, right? And catalyzed us envisioning worlds and situations and such, which really is a sub-form of dreaming. It's pretty amazing that we have minds that are completely capable of forming what seems to be, at least locally, a coherent entire universe without any obvious external stimuli, however external stimuli may affect dreaming. And yet, while we're awake, most of us resist this activity most of the time. We're not visionary, right? We tend to be pretty cognitive. Now, those of us who are artists, we enact aspects of visionary consciousness in creating poems or music or writing or dance or drama. We imagine another world in which beings are interacting, or situations are happening, or sounds are being emitted and transformed over time, or the language is being released from its ordinary prison of expected structure and form and grammar. And not all of these experiments are beautiful to everyone. Some of the experiments are terrifying or ugly or poorly done or whatever. But that experimental visionary behavior is profound and deeply involves memory, as does dreaming. So when you think carefully about, what if we wanted to figure out What if we wanted a decent starting place to think about the supercontainer from? Memory is one of them. But I would add something to that. I would say it's memory in communion, co-mutual unity. It's not just memory, some quality or propensity of stuff or feelings or energy. It's relation and the anciently conserved aspects of relation that become embodied. Now, of course, when we think about the supercontainer, what everything is, what everything's doing, what everything's for, what everything's about, the purpose of everything, things like this. Unfortunately, we tend to think in categories and forms that are familiar to us from our kind of ordinary lives, but the topic is fundamentally non-ordinary. So we're in a bit of a we're in danger of giving in to our habits and the impoverishments they usually induce or introduce. But when we think about anything that progenerates many beings and many forms of being, and in fact progenerates the possibility of minds and bodies and souls and such, as long as we evict the non-ordinary, in a way not too dissimilar to how cities evict nature, as long as we evict the non-ordinary and sort of cage it and formulate it so that it's predictable and stuff, then we find ourselves in a peculiar situation. We have to think from outside the classes and categories and qualities that we're ordinarily trapped in. And that's not as challenging as it sounds. In fact, usually it feels really good. It's a really exciting and liberating experience that doesn't destroy those things. We still have access to them. It just gives us a starting position beyond them. For most people, they may think about the sun as a big explosion in the sky, and the sun is a supercontainer topic. It's what I call a holophore, one of the primordially important concept elements in our lexicons and ideas, right? It's uncommon that people look to the sun and think, here is the progenitor of worlds. This, more than just a being, is the cause and origin of minds, including the mind with which I now behold and consider it. Now, there are many mundane things, more mundane things than the sun, that also have this quality. Trees are a simple example. On Earth, trees are fundamental to everything. Your body is tree-like. Your limbs are tree-like. We have branches and extensions and roots. We keep our feet in shoes in the dark most of the time. Not an accident. And not just to protect our feet. So when we think of meta-topics like memory, or light, or time, or dreaming, or birth and death, the sun, organisms, we should be cautious about beginning with our commonly held notions, and I really mean the word notion, beliefs, ideas, definitions, and so on. We should be very skeptical about this, because Well, there's a technical problem having to do with set theory. Right? I'll state one of the versions briefly, but I'll try and make a simpler construct. Does the set of all sets that don't contain themselves contain itself or not? And this is the problem when we think about metatopics. Our derivative concepts cannot encompass their own origin. Their origin is something directly accessible deep within us, but it cannot be encompassed by concepts. Concepts are derivations of it. So in the same way, minds created computers. Human minds built computers. Computers didn't build human minds, though they influenced them deeply. And so computers aren't minds. Computers are a derivative product of a very narrow and specific form of goal-seeking behavior and technological memory, meaning accomplishments over time. But the mind with which we consider the sun and, quote, what it is, or, quote, what it is doing, well, what it is doing around here is pretty much everything. If that thing goes away, you got nada. Right? The planets will spin apart. All life on Earth would perish very quickly, but not instantly, in so much as we understand physics today. All minds would be gone. No sun, no minds. Right? And this brings up the topic of precedence. And in metatopics, we must preserve the precedence of the metatopic, like memory, or the sun, or the universe, and not allow it to be collapsed into some technological representation, like a hologram or a computer, which is just as ridiculous as saying that, like, your actual human hand is really nothing other than a fork. It's just a peculiar fork. There's no possibility of this being true. One can think this way and form this idea, but it's an idea that is intelligence destroying and awareness destroying. It's a great impoverishment. And remember at the beginning that I said, when we think about metatopics like the universe or God, time or light, we need to preserve the mystery. What's actually been described and quote-unquote explained is always some incredibly modest, tiny percentage of what can be known, especially if we were free of the habits that thus impoverish us, even for a few moments. Right? So I'm a big fan of that liberation. I'd like us all to be able to consider the nature of the deep questions about life, birth and death, time and light, the universe, divine beings, non-ordinary reality, dreaming, friendship, love, all these things, in much deeper ways than we commonly are trained to by our language and culture. The universe is not a Hallmark card. For the Greeks, mnemosine, the word that we get another programming term, mnemonic, from, though that term has other uses. Mnemosine was a divine being who was memory, and she was the mother of the muses. I don't recall the common catalogues of muses. I think Terpsichore was one of them. There was one that represented epic poetry, and so on. And another that represented lyric poetry, these two being seen as distinct, which is a reasonable distinction. The Iliad is epic poetry. Lyric poetry is the stuff that's musical. rather than dramatic. In any case, what they intended, I think, was to understand that without memory, there is nothing. There are no arts. There is no knowledge. There are no languages. There is no music. There is no dance. Memory is everything, in a way. And again, let's preserve the mystery, right? What do we mean by memory? But of course, I tried to have a clumsy go at that by saying the conservation of forms, relationships, transformations, and the re-expression of these forms, transformations, and relationships over time in new embodiments and potentials and forms, possibilities, opportunities. Now there's something fundamental going on. Once you have memory, now you have, and perhaps it's possible without memory, though it's hard for me to imagine how, but now you have the plausible arisal of it, something that we would refer to as intelligence. And I'm using this word with an asterisk to mean all the forms of intelligence, endless forms. And really each kind of relation is a form of time, a reenaction of memory, and a form of intelligence. And so time, memory, and intelligence, these form a sort of braid, right? From which we might imagine all experienceable reality emerges. But it's not my intent to collapse the supercontainer to memory. I was just thinking, if I wanted to have a go, what could I pick that would at least relieve me of some of the common limitations and perhaps grant me some new insights? And this is how I believe we become more aware and more intelligent, by experimenting in this way, right? Can I be more deeply present? Can I be more deeply loving? Can I activate my curiosity and fascination in such a way that they shed new forms of light in my mind and awareness and body, so that new opportunities and potentials for development and understanding and the dissolution or dissolving of common errors, right? Getting rid of impediments, that are otherwise have a very strong grasp or enclosure of our minds and potentials and awareness. So I'm not sure if I finished my walk yet. I accomplished one of my minimal goals, which was to visit an old place. And I think for now, I'll probably wrap up the recording and hope that perhaps within it, you may have found something enlightening or memorable, something that will add new opportunities to your life and mind and wonder. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again sometime very soon.